My neighbor demanded I cut down my oak tree or he'd sue for property damage, so I cut it down completely. That tree was shading his backyard workshop from the delivery drones. Now, everyone can see exactly what he's been building in there. The ATF found out first. The morning 17 federal agents surrounded my neighbor's house. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, watching through the window where my grandfather's oak tree used to be. 6 black SUVs, 3 unmarked sedans, and a mobile command unit had materialized on Birchwood Lane sometime between 5:47 and 5:52 a.m. I know the exact window because my coffee maker is programmed to start at 5:45, and I'd walked into the kitchen right as it finished brewing. By the time I poured my first cup, men in tactical gear were breaching Dennis Holloway's front door with a battering ram. The sound was like thunder trapped in a metal box. His wife Linda came running out the side door in her nightgown, screaming something I couldn't make out from across the yard. 2 agents intercepted her before she made it to the driveway. Dennis himself emerged from the backyard workshop moments later, hands raised, wearing the same oil-stained coveralls I'd seen him in 100 times before. He looked directly at me through the gap where 63 years of oak tree used to stand, and his face twisted into something I'll never forget. Pure hatred. Like I'd personally called in the raid myself. I hadn't. But I understood why he thought so. That oak tree had been planted by my grandfather in 1961, the same year he built this house with his own hands. He'd chosen the spot carefully, right at the corner of our property where the branches would eventually shade both our backyard and a portion of the lot next door. Back then, the neighboring property was owned by the Kirkland family, and my grandfather and Howard Kirkland had been friends. The shade was a gift, intentional, designed to keep both families cool during the brutal Missouri summers before central air conditioning became standard. My grandfather died in 1989, and my father inherited the house. I grew up climbing that tree, building forts in its branches, carving my initials into its trunk when I was 11 years old. When my father passed away 3 years ago, the house came to me. I'm 38 years old, a mechanical engineer at a firm downtown, divorced for 2 years, no kids. This house and that tree were the only family I had left. The tree had survived ice storms, droughts, lightning strikes, and 73 years of Missouri weather. It did not survive Dennis Holloway. Dennis moved in next door 4 years ago, right after the Kirkland place finally sold. Howard Kirkland's daughter had been renting it out for years after her father's death, but she'd finally decided to cash out and retire to Arizona. Dennis paid cash for the property, which should have been my first warning sign. Who pays $287,000 in cash for a house in a middle-class suburb? He told everyone he'd made good investments in tech stocks during the pandemic, said he'd worked in manufacturing his whole life, but retired early when his portfolio exploded. He seemed normal enough at first. Quiet, kept to himself, drove a dark blue Ford F250 that always looked freshly washed. His wife Linda was friendly in that superficial neighborhood way, bringing over cookies at Christmas, waving from the driveway. They didn't have kids, didn't host parties, didn't cause problems. For the first 2 years, Dennis Holloway was the perfect neighbor. Then he started building the workshop. It began in the spring of 2022. Dennis applied for a building permit to construct what he called a hobby workshop in his backyard. The plans showed a modest structure, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with electrical hookups and basic ventilation. Nothing unusual. Half the men on Birchwood Lane had workshops or sheds. The city approved it without issue, and construction started in April. By June, the structure was complete. From the outside, it looked exactly like what the permit described, a simple metal building with a single roll-up door and 2 windows. Dennis told anyone who asked that he was getting into woodworking, said he'd always wanted to build furniture but never had the time while he was working. He even showed me a coffee table he'd supposedly made, a decent piece with tapered legs and a walnut finish. I congratulated him on his craftsmanship. I had no reason to suspect it was purchased from a furniture store in Kansas City and artificially distressed to look handmade. Not then. The complaints about the oak tree started 6 months after the workshop was finished. Dennis knocked on my door one Saturday morning in October 2022, his face arranged in that particular expression people wear when they're about to ask for something unreasonable but want to seem friendly about it. The tree, he said, was dropping leaves all over his property. The acorns were denting the roof of his workshop. The roots were probably damaging his foundation. He'd done some research, he claimed, and trees that old often had extensive root systems that could cause thousands of dollars in structural damage. He suggested, politely at first, that I consider having it trimmed back significantly, maybe even removed entirely. I listened to his concerns, nodded in all the right places, and then told him the tree was staying. It had been there 60 years before his workshop existed. If he was worried about acorns, he could buy a tarp. Dennis didn't like that answer. Over the next several months, he escalated his campaign against the oak tree with a persistence that bordered on obsessive. He filed complaints with the city claiming the tree was diseased and posed a danger to the community. An arborist from the Parks Department, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Thornton with 22 years of experience in urban forestry, came out to inspect it. She found nothing wrong. The tree was healthy, well-maintained, and posed no structural risk to any surrounding property. She told me privately that she'd never seen such a frivolous complaint. Dennis then claimed the tree was blocking sunlight from reaching his garden, even though his garden was on the opposite side of his yard. He claimed the tree was attracting vermin, squirrels, and raccoons that were invading his property, as if wildlife could be zoned out of existence. He called code enforcement so many times that the officer assigned to our area, a tired-looking man named Gerald Briggs, started apologizing to me every time he showed up to investigate another baseless claim. The lawsuit threat came in March 2023. Dennis had hired an attorney, a man named Richard Keating from a firm downtown that specialized in property disputes. The letter arrived on a Thursday, certified mail, 3 pages of dense legal language claiming my oak tree had caused significant structural damage to Dennis's workshop foundation and demanding either the removal of the tree or compensation of $45,000 for repairs. The letter included photographs of cracks in the workshop's concrete slab, supposedly caused by root intrusion. It also included a report from a structural engineer named Thomas Bradley, who claimed to have assessed the damage and traced it directly to my tree's root system. The letter gave me 30 days to respond before they would file suit in circuit court. I read it 3 times, my jaw tightening with each pass. Then I called my own lawyer. Margaret Sullivan had been practicing property law in Missouri for 31 years. She'd handled my father's estate, my divorce, and every legal question I'd had since moving back to this house. I trusted her completely. When I read her the letter, she made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "This is absurd," she said. "Root intrusion claims require clear evidence that specific roots from your tree penetrated his structure. You can't just point at some cracks and blame the nearest tree. But here's the problem, Kevin. Even frivolous lawsuits cost money to defend. If this Richard Keating is willing to drag this out, you're looking at $10,000 to $20,000 in legal fees just to prove what we already know." I asked her what my options were. She laid them out carefully. Fight it, which would be expensive but winnable. Negotiate some kind of settlement, which would feel like rewarding bad behavior. Or remove the tree, which would eliminate his claimed cause of action entirely. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at my grandfather's oak, its branches just beginning to bud with spring growth. I wasn't going to cut it down. Not for Dennis Holloway. Not for anyone. The next 8 months were a war of attrition. Dennis filed his lawsuit in April, and the legal process ground forward with agonizing slowness. Depositions, discovery requests, expert witness reports. I had my own arborist, Dr. Thornton from the city, provide a counter-report stating the tree showed no signs of invasive root growth in the direction of Dennis's property. I hired a structural engineer named Patricia Webb, 26 years of experience, who examined Dennis's workshop and concluded the cracks were consistent with improper concrete mixing during construction, not root damage. The case was weak, and everyone knew it, but Dennis kept pushing. His attorney filed motion after motion, requested continuance after continuance. The legal fees piled up. By November, I'd spent nearly $15,000 defending a tree that had done nothing wrong. Margaret warned me that Dennis seemed willing to spend whatever it took to make me miserable. "Some people don't want to win," she said. "They just want to watch you lose." During this time, I started noticing things about Dennis's workshop that didn't quite fit the woodworking story. The building had ventilation fans that ran constantly, even in winter, powerful exhaust systems that seemed excessive for a hobby shop. Delivery trucks arrived at odd hours, usually early morning or late evening, dropping off packages that Dennis would quickly move inside. The workshop lights stayed on late into the night, and sometimes I'd hear sounds that didn't match woodworking at all. Metallic grinding, drilling, occasional sharp bangs that echoed across the yard. I told myself it was none of my business. Plenty of hobbyists work strange hours. Plenty of projects require equipment that sounds industrial. I had enough on my plate with the lawsuit without inventing new problems. But the observations stuck in my mind like splinters I couldn't quite reach. One night in December, I woke up around 3:15 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed lights flickering in Dennis's backyard. Through my window, I could see shadows moving behind the frosted windows of his workshop. I watched for maybe 5 minutes, telling myself I was being paranoid, before going back to bed. But I didn't sleep well after that. Something about those late-night activities felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The next morning, I mentioned it casually to my neighbor on the other side, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Owens. She nodded slowly, her face troubled. "I've noticed it too," she said. "Strange sounds, strange hours. And have you seen the packages he receives?" I went online once and looked up one of the company names on a box. It was a supplier of machining equipment, industrial lathes, mills, that sort of thing. What does a woodworker need with industrial machining equipment? I didn't have an answer. The turning point came in January 2024, almost a year after the lawsuit was filed. I was driving home from work when I saw something that made me pull over and stare. A drone, one of those large commercial delivery drones that Amazon had started using in our area, was hovering above Dennis's property. It seemed to be having difficulty finding a landing spot, circling and recircling over his backyard. After about 30 seconds, it gave up and flew off toward the distribution center. I didn't think much of it at the time. Delivery drones were still new, still working out kinks in their routing algorithms. But over the next few weeks, I noticed the pattern. Drones would approach Dennis's property and always veer away, unable or unwilling to descend into his backyard. I mentioned this to Dorothy, who said she'd noticed the same thing. Her packages sometimes arrived by drone, and they always landed in her front yard, never the back, even when the back would have been more convenient. Dennis's packages, by contrast, always came by truck. That's when I started to understand why Dennis wanted my oak tree gone so desperately. The tree's canopy extended over a significant portion of his backyard, providing shade and cover to his workshop and the surrounding area. As long as that tree stood, aerial views of his property were obstructed. Delivery drones couldn't see clear landing zones. More importantly, anything that might be photographed from above, by drones, by satellites, by curious neighbors with their own aerial cameras, was hidden beneath 60 years of foliage. Dennis didn't care about acorns or roots or property damage. He cared about visibility. He needed that tree gone because it was the only thing preventing people from seeing what he was really doing in that workshop. The realization hit me like ice water. What could he possibly be building that required that level of concealment? I started paying closer attention after that. Made notes of delivery times, truck license plates, the duration of late-night work sessions. I felt like a paranoid fool, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something genuinely wrong was happening next door. In February, I witnessed something that confirmed my suspicions. It was a Saturday afternoon, unusually warm for winter, and I was in my backyard raking leaves that had blown in from the neighboring yards. Dennis's workshop door was partially open, and I heard voices inside. Male voices, at least 3 distinct ones, discussing something in urgent tones. I moved closer to my property line, pretending to examine my fence, and caught fragments of conversation. The phrase "lower receiver" floated across the yard, followed by "batch of 30" and "shipping next week." I didn't know much about firearms, but I knew enough to recognize those terms. Lower receivers are the regulated part of a rifle, the piece that legally constitutes the firearm itself. A batch of 30, shipping next week. The implications made my stomach clench. I called Margaret Sullivan that evening and told her what I'd heard. She was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Kevin," she said carefully, "if what you're suggesting is true, this goes way beyond a property dispute. Manufacturing firearms without a license is a federal crime. Selling them is even worse. But you don't have proof. You have fragments of a conversation that could mean anything. If you go to the authorities with this and you're wrong, Dennis will use it against you in the lawsuit. He'll claim harassment, defamation, everything in the book." I asked her what I should do. She didn't have a good answer. Neither did I. I spent the next week wrestling with the decision, watching Dennis come and go, watching the delivery trucks arrive, listening to the sounds of machinery grinding late into the night. I didn't call the police. I didn't call anyone. I just watched, and worried, and waited. The lawsuit hearing was scheduled for early March. Margaret had filed a motion to dismiss based on the lack of credible evidence, and the judge had agreed to hear arguments. If we won, the case would be over. If we lost, we'd be looking at a full trial, more months of legal fees, more stress, more of Dennis Holloway's smug face across a courtroom. The week before the hearing, Dennis made one final attempt at intimidation. He knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening, his expression cold and flat. "I'll make you a deal," he said. "Drop your motion to dismiss, agree to remove the tree, and I'll drop the lawsuit. We can both walk away clean." I asked him why the tree mattered so much to him. He didn't blink. "It's my property," he said. "I should be able to see the sky from my own backyard." There was something in his voice, a tightness, an urgency, that told me everything I needed to know. He was afraid, not of the lawsuit, not of the legal fees. He was afraid of what would happen if that tree came down. And in that moment, standing on my front porch looking into the eyes of a man who had spent 18 months trying to destroy me, I made my decision. I called Margaret the next morning. "Drop the motion to dismiss," I said. "Tell Dennis I'll remove the tree." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Kevin, are you sure? We're going to win this motion. His case is garbage." "I know," I said, "but I want the tree gone." She tried to talk me out of it for 20 minutes, but I held firm. By the end of the day, the paperwork was filed. Dennis Holloway had won, or so he thought. I contacted a tree removal service that same week, a company called Branson Brothers Arboriculture, owned by 2 siblings named Thomas and David Branson, who had been removing trees in the area for 28 years. They came out on Friday to assess the job, and Thomas whistled when he saw the oak. "This is a beautiful specimen," he said. "You sure you want to take it down?" "I'm sure," I said. He quoted me $4,200 for complete removal, including stump grinding and debris hauling. I wrote him a check for half that afternoon. They scheduled the job for the following Saturday. The night before the tree came down, I sat in my backyard with a bottle of whiskey and said goodbye to 63 years of family history. I thought about my grandfather planting that sapling, my father teaching me to climb its branches, my own initials still visible in the bark if you knew where to look. I thought about Sunday afternoons in its shade, about the tire swing that had hung from its lowest branch when I was 8, about the countless hours I'd spent staring up through its leaves at the summer sky. The tree had been there my entire life. It had been there before I was born, before my parents were married, before this neighborhood was anything more than farmland and dreams. And now it was coming down because a man I barely knew was hiding something in his backyard that he didn't want anyone to see. I raised my glass to the oak one final time. "I'm sorry," I said out loud, "but this is the only way." The tree didn't answer. Trees never do. But I like to think it understood. The Branson brothers arrived at 7:30 a.m. on Saturday with a crew of 5 men, 2 trucks, a crane, and a wood chipper the size of a small car. Dennis was watching from his kitchen window. I could feel his eyes on me as I stood in my yard, arms crossed, watching the crew prepare their equipment. Thomas Branson approached me one more time before they started. "Last chance," he said. "Once we start cutting, there's no going back." I nodded. "Do it." The chainsaws roared to life at 8 a.m. The first branches came down within minutes, massive limbs that crashed to the ground with thunderous impact. The crew worked efficiently, sectioning the tree from top to bottom, feeding branches into the chipper, lowering trunk sections with the crane. By noon, the canopy that had shaded this corner of the neighborhood for 63 years was gone. By 3 p.m., the trunk was reduced to sections stacked in my driveway, destined for a lumber mill that would turn my grandfather's legacy into someone's dining room table. By 5 p.m., even the stump was gone, ground into sawdust and hauled away. Where the oak had stood, there was nothing but a circle of bare dirt and wood chips. I walked to the property line and looked at Dennis's backyard for the first time without the tree in the way. The view was completely unobstructed now. His workshop sat in the middle of the yard like an exposed nerve, its metal walls gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. The roof was visible, cluttered with ventilation equipment I hadn't been able to see before. The windows, previously hidden by leaves, now reflected the sky like blank eyes. And most importantly, the entire property was now clearly visible from above. No shade, no cover, no concealment. Just a metal building sitting in an open yard, completely exposed to any aerial observation that might happen to pass by. Dennis came outside as the Branson brothers pulled away. He stood at his back door, staring at the empty space where the tree had been, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Relief first, then satisfaction, then something else. Something that looked almost like concern. He glanced up at the sky, then back at his workshop, then at me. I waved. He didn't wave back, just turned around and went inside. That night, his workshop lights stayed dark for the first time in months. The first delivery drone appeared 3 days later. I was working from home, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when I heard the distinctive whir of rotors overhead. I looked out the window and saw an Amazon drone descending toward Dennis's backyard, its package clutched in mechanical claws. It landed smoothly on his back lawn, deposited the package, and lifted off again. As it rose, I noticed something. The drone's camera was pointed directly at Dennis's workshop, recording everything as part of its standard navigation protocol. Amazon drones photograph their landing zones for quality assurance purposes. It's all automated, all stored on corporate servers, all theoretically accessible to anyone with the right authorization. The tree was gone, and now every drone that flew over Dennis's property was taking pictures. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. I just knew something would. 2 weeks later, I learned that Amazon drone footage had been subpoenaed by federal authorities in an unrelated investigation somewhere in the Midwest. The news article didn't specify what the investigation was about, just that drone delivery footage had proven valuable in documenting suspicious activity at a private residence. I read that article 3 times, my heart pounding. It wasn't about Dennis, at least not yet. But it proved that my theory was sound. Drone footage was being used by law enforcement, and every drone that flew over our neighborhood was now capturing clear, unobstructed images of Dennis Holloway's backyard workshop. The clock was ticking. I just didn't know how fast. The ATF doesn't announce their investigations in advance. You don't get a warning letter, a courtesy call, a heads up from a friendly agent. One day, everything is normal, and the next day, 17 federal agents are surrounding your neighbor's house at 5:47 in the morning. I learned later that the investigation had been building for months before the tree came down. Dennis Holloway, whose real name turned out to be Dennis Wayne Kowalski, had been on a watch list for nearly 2 years. He'd been linked to online forums where people discussed manufacturing untraceable firearms, so-called ghost guns, that had no serial numbers and couldn't be tracked. He'd purchased thousands of dollars worth of machining equipment under various aliases. He'd been careful, methodical, patient. But he'd made one critical error. He'd built his operation in a suburban backyard, relying on an oak tree that didn't belong to him to provide the aerial cover he needed to avoid detection. When the tree came down, everything changed. Delivery drones began photographing his property on a regular basis. Satellite imagery that had previously shown nothing but a green canopy now showed a metal building with suspicious ventilation equipment. An anonymous tip, not from me, led investigators to review the available aerial footage. What they found was enough to obtain a warrant. On the morning of the raid, federal agents recovered 43 completed AR-15-style rifles with no serial numbers, 72 unfinished lower receivers, industrial manufacturing equipment valued at over $200,000, and detailed records of sales to individuals in 14 different states. Dennis Holloway, or Kowalski, or whatever his name really was, had been running one of the largest illegal firearms manufacturing operations in the Midwest, all from a backyard workshop that had been hidden beneath my grandfather's oak tree. I watched them lead him away in handcuffs, his oil-stained coveralls replaced by an orange jumpsuit. Linda Holloway, who claimed to have known nothing about her husband's activities, was taken in for questioning, but ultimately released without charges. The house sat empty for weeks, Yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the wind, federal vehicles coming and going as investigators documented every piece of evidence. The local news covered the story extensively. A TF bust uncovers ghost gun factory in quiet suburb, the headlines read. Neighbors shocked by illegal weapons cache next door. One reporter actually knocked on my door and asked if I'd noticed anything suspicious. I told her I'd been too focused on my tree to pay much attention to what was happening in the workshop. It wasn't entirely a lie. The criminal case against Dennis Holloway moved through the federal court system with surprising speed. He was charged with 18 counts of manufacturing firearms without a license, 12 counts of illegal sale of firearms, and 6 counts of conspiracy to traffic untraceable weapons across state lines. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the physical evidence, the manufacturing equipment, the sales records, and testimony from 3 buyers who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Dennis's public defender tried to argue entrapment, tried to claim the drone surveillance was unconstitutional, tried everything he could think of. None of it worked. The evidence was too clear, too comprehensive, too damning. In October 2024, Dennis Wayne Kowalski pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 15 to 20 years. The judge gave him 18. He'll be eligible for parole in 2039, assuming good behavior. He'll be 71 years old. I testified at the sentencing hearing, not about the crimes themselves, but about the years of harassment, the frivolous lawsuit, the relentless campaign to force me to remove a tree that had stood for 63 years. The prosecutor used my testimony to demonstrate premeditation, to show that Dennis had deliberately targeted my tree specifically because it was blocking aerial surveillance of his operation. The judge listened carefully, asked several questions, and ultimately cited my testimony in his sentencing remarks. The defendant's systematic efforts to eliminate obstacles to his criminal enterprise, including legal harassment of an innocent neighbor, demonstrate a level of calculated malice that goes beyond mere opportunism, he said. Mr. Kowalski built his operation with full awareness of the concealment his location provided, and he was willing to destroy another family's heritage to protect his illegal activities. I sat in that courtroom and listened to those words, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Just a profound, exhausted sadness. The oak tree is gone. Nothing will bring it back. 63 years of growth, of history, of family memory, reduced to sawdust and lumber. I had the larger trunk sections milled into boards, and I'm slowly building a set of furniture with them. A coffee table, a bookshelf, maybe a desk if there's enough material. My grandfather built this house with his own hands, and now I'm building something with the tree he planted. It feels right somehow. A continuation rather than an ending. The lumber guy said the wood had beautiful grain, tight and consistent, the mark of a tree that had grown slowly and steadily for decades. I run my hands over those boards sometimes and think about all the years they represent. All the summers and winters, all the storms and droughts, all the life that passed beneath those branches. The tree deserved better than to become collateral damage in a federal investigation. But at least something of it survives. Dennis Holloway's house sold at auction 6 months after his conviction. The proceeds went to pay legal fees and federal fines. A young couple bought it, newlyweds with plans to start a family. They tore down the workshop within a week of moving in, replaced it with a vegetable garden and a swing set. The wife, a woman named Claire, stopped by one afternoon to introduce herself. She'd heard about the previous owner, she said, and wanted to assure me that nothing like that would ever happen in their home. They were just regular people, she said, looking to raise kids in a quiet neighborhood. I welcomed them to Birchwood Lane and meant it. Not all neighbors are criminals. Some of them are just people trying to live their lives. The trick is figuring out which is which before it's too late. Margaret Sullivan sent me a final bill last month, itemizing all the legal fees from the lawsuit that never went to trial. The total came to $17,342. I paid it without complaint. It was worth every penny, not because I won, but because I learned something important. Sometimes the battles that seem most pointless lead to the most unexpected outcomes. If I'd fought harder, if I'd won the motion to dismiss, that tree would still be standing, and Dennis Holloway would still be manufacturing illegal weapons under its cover. My surrender, my decision to give him exactly what he demanded, was the thing that ultimately destroyed him. He wanted the tree gone. He got what he wanted, and everything that happened after that was his own doing. I planted a new tree last spring. Not an oak this time, but a Japanese maple, a smaller variety that will never grow tall enough to shade the neighboring property. It sits in a different corner of my yard, where I can see it from my bedroom window. The leaves turn brilliant red in autumn, and the branches have an elegant, graceful shape that catches the morning light. It's not my grandfather's tree. Nothing could be. But it's mine, and it's growing, and that's enough. Some things can't be replaced. Some losses are permanent. But life continues, and new things take root, and eventually the empty spaces fill with something new. I learned that from watching the Kowalski house transform from a crime scene to a family home. I learned it from watching my own yard heal over the wound where 63 years of oak tree used to stand. Some things can't be replaced, but that doesn't mean they can't be honored. Dennis Holloway demanded I remove my oak tree or he'd sue me into bankruptcy. So I removed it completely. Every branch, every leaf, every root. That tree had been providing cover for a federal crime, and neither of us knew it until it was too late. Him, because he thought the tree would protect his secrets forever. Me, because I never imagined my quiet neighbor was running an illegal arms factory in his backyard workshop. The ATF found out first, but the whole neighborhood found out second. The whole country found out third, when the story made national news. And Dennis, sitting in a federal prison cell somewhere in Kansas, will have 18 years to think about what might have been different if he'd just left my tree alone. I think about that sometimes. If he hadn't been so obsessed with eliminating every possible risk, if he'd just learned to live with a few acorns on his workshop roof, he might still be free today. His operation might still be running. Hundreds more untraceable weapons might be circulating through the country. But he couldn't leave well enough alone. He had to push, had to threaten, had to sue. He had to make me choose between my family's legacy and my financial survival. I chose survival. And in doing so, I accidentally chose justice too. My grandfather used to say that trees are patient. They grow slowly, they stand firm, they endure. They don't react to every wind or storm. They just keep reaching toward the light, year after year, decade after decade. He was talking about trees, but I think he was talking about life too, about the importance of standing firm, of enduring, of not letting temporary setbacks knock you off your roots. I tried to follow that advice during the worst months of the lawsuit, tried to be patient, to endure, to wait for the storm to pass. In the end, I couldn't save the tree, but I like to think I honored its memory by standing firm against a man who thought he could bully me into submission. I gave him what he wanted, but not for the reasons he thought. I gave him what he wanted because I knew, somehow, that it would be his undoing. Maybe that's not patience. Maybe that's something else entirely. Revenge, perhaps. Or justice. Or just the universe's way of balancing the scales. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.